Coming up, what is the benefit of a cross-axle diff lock in a proper four-wheel drive? And do you really need to spend the $5,000 extra to get one? I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, the place where Australian new car buyers save thousands off their next new cars. Hit me up on the website for that. A quick tip today, okay, based on a question from Claus. I need a car that will tow more than 2 tonnes, so that puts me in the range of the Pajero Sport, Trailblazer, MUX, Prado, etc. I've driven all and quite happy with the Pajero Sport. Seems the more comfortable on bitumen and good seats. How important is the rear diff lock, as the GLX does not have this, but $5,000 cheaper than the GLS? I do not see myself doing major crazy off-roading, possibly sand, but not too difficult tracks. Let's just go back to basics for one moment and think about how a differential works, okay? And all a diff does is it takes drive in the middle and it pumps it out to a couple of other drive shafts, usually axle type drive shafts, but it might be prop shafts front and rear for the center differential. So what happens there is, if one wheel loses traction because it's airborne or because it's on snow or ice or something, or mud, then that's where the drive goes, okay? And the other wheel, the one with traction, just goes nowhere. So that's kind of inconvenient. But the good thing about differentials is they allow those axles where the drive comes out to turn at different rates. And you really need that in a vehicle on a high traction surface, because as the car drives around a corner, not only does the front end and the rear end go through a different path, and therefore the drive shafts front and rear need to turn at different rates, but the wheels on the left side and the wheels on the right side turn at different rates as well. And what that basically means is, to be in all-wheel drive mode on a high traction surface, you need a differential in the center of the vehicle so that the front and the rear can turn at different rates. And then you need cross-axle differentials on the front and the rear axles so that the left side and the rear side can also turn at different rates. And what this means is, if you don't have any diff locks, no center diff lock and no cross-axle diff locks front and rear, one wheel needs to spin and then drive to all other 3 just disappears, okay? And that's kind of bad, because if one wheel driving on, I don't know, sand or something, and one wheel falls into a really soft hole and just digs itself down, then the other 3 might still have sufficient traction to carry you forward, but they're not going anywhere, because the one wheel that is bogged is allowing all those differentials just to keep spinning sort of pointlessly in this case. So if you put a center differential lock in place, as the Pajero Sport has with its Super Select 2 transfer case, then what needs to happen in order to stop your progress is you need to have a front wheel and a back wheel spinning at the same time. So when you think about it, a center diff lock gives you twice as much traction in soft, slippery conditions. And the same thing if you're in really broken terrain as well, like rock hopping. You'll go nowhere if 2 wheels, one at the front and one at the rear, are sort of up in the air. But if you've only got one wheel up in the air and the center diff lock engaged, you will absolutely still have some forward drive. And what you see on really soft terrain, typically sand, is that when a vehicle with the center diff lock, or a conventional 4-wheel drive where you've just got 2 high and 4 high with a straight through drive with the front and rear prop shafts locked up, when that's engaged like that and the vehicle gets bogged in sand, you typically see diagonally opposite wheels at full droop, like the front right and the back left, or vice versa. They just dig themselves a hole and the vehicle goes nowhere. And this is typically the sort of situation where a cross-axle differential can help, because if you lock the rear cross-axle differential, then what you need to have happen in order to go nowhere is you need to have both rear wheels spinning and one at the front. And it's actually pretty hard to do that. I mean, in really soft stuff, you can absolutely be in that condition. In mud or really soft sand, you can find the vehicle just sitting on its chassis and both back wheels spinning and the front wheel spinning, and you're going nowhere. You'll be getting out a shovel to get going forward. But in these sort of extreme low traction situations, a rear differential lock can help. And I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, how often, if ever, are you going to need that? Because if you're just driving on easy tracks and a bit of easy sort of sand driving, you're hardly ever going to need that. And the question for me would be not so much do I need the rear diff lock, but do I like the extra features that come packaged with the GLS? Because it's not just $5,000 for the rear diff lock, right? It's $5,000 for the whole spec package that goes with GLS. And I guess that's a subjective determination that you've got to make based on the way you want the vehicle to be and the way you intend to use it and what the worst case scenario might be for you. And the next thing to consider, I guess, is can these devices be abused? And I'd suggest you can unwittingly abuse them. And the more diff locks you've got, the easier it is to unwittingly abuse them. See, the dark side of locking diffs up is the stress that it can potentially impose on the drivetrain, because an open differential is kind of like a stress reliever for transmission wind up. You know, when one shaft wants to turn at a different rate, it can. Okay, and then you don't break something expensive, which is kind of fortunate. So if you've got the center diff locked and the rear diff locked, and you're suddenly on a high traction piece of terrain, like, I don't know, bitumen, or just a bit of dirt or gravel that's all sort of stuck together and provides reasonably high traction, or a rock shelf, like a granite shelf or a sandstone shelf, and you want to turn that vehicle through a significant turning sort of radius, then having a diff locked is really going to hurt your forward progress. It could damage the transmission, and you don't want that. When I say it can hurt the forward progress, it's like this. If you've got the center differential locked, then the front and rear prop shafts will be turning at the same rate, and they want to turn at different rates because the front end wants to turn through a different radius than the rear end when you're going around a corner. So having the center diff locked not only stresses the transmission, but it also reduces the steering effectiveness when you're in that high traction situation. And you can transition between slippery terrain and high traction terrain when you're driving off-road very rapidly. So that's something to be aware of. Maybe the off-roading bug will really bite you and you'll want to tackle increasingly difficult terrain, and if you want to do that, then maybe the big spend up front is going to be a benefit to you. But if not, I'd suggest save the big bucks and just drive around with a center diff lock, which effectively doubles your tractive effort anyway.